Welcome to our deep dive into early Islam. We're going to tackle some really interesting questions about Muhammad and his relationship with Meccan trade. You sent over this academic article, and it really challenges the traditional narrative. I'm super excited to get into it with you.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to re-examine, these narratives that have been kind of set in stone for so long,
Yeah.
and see them from a fresh perspective.
Absolutely. So the traditional Islamic sources, things like the Sirah, they really emphasize how Muhammad disrupted Meccan trade. Things like caravan raids, especially in those years right after he moved to Medina. In fact, some sources even claim that these raids like almost shut down Meccan trade with Syria entirely. That paints quite a dramatic picture, right?
Yeah, it really does, and it's definitely the image that a lot of people have in their heads about that period. But when we start to kind of look at the details, we find some interesting discrepancies and maybe even some exaggerations.
Okay, let's unpack that. What kind of discrepancies are we talking about here?
Well, take for example the story of Sa'd bi Abi Waqqas, one of Muhammad's companions. He's often portrayed as this, incredible archer who's super eager to clash with the Meccans. But when you look at other sources, they actually depict him avoiding battle on a number of occasions. It's almost like um, his descendants, wanted to make their ancestor look a little more heroic in the retelling.
That's a really interesting point. It really reminds us that these sources aren't just, neutral recordings of what happened. They're often crafted with very specific intentions. Makes you wonder what else might have been, I don't know, embellished or altered over time.
Exactly. And this pattern becomes even more apparent when we look at how the whole narrative of caravan raiding kind of evolves in later sources.
Hmm.
So, for example, you have al-Waqidi writing in the 9th century, and he places a much heavier emphasis on these raids than earlier sources do. It begs the question, were later authors trying to portray the early Muslims as maybe more powerful and aggressive than they actually were?
Almost like they were rewriting history to kind of fit this certain image of early Islam.
Precisely. And this highlights a really crucial point for anyone who's engaging with historical sources. They're
Hmm.
so important to consider, who wrote them, when they wrote them, and why they wrote them. Every account has a perspective, and understanding that perspective is key to analyzing the information objectively.
That's such a valuable takeaway for our listeners. We can't just take these stories at face value. We really have to think critically about where they're coming from and what purpose they might have served.
Absolutely. And that critical lens becomes even more important when we examine events like the Battle of Badr, often considered this huge turning point in the traditional narrative.
Right. The story goes that Muhammad attempted to raid a caravan. The Meccans retaliated, and this led to this decisive victory for the Muslims. It's presented as this key moment where Muhammad's actions against Meccan trade really come to a head, but you're suggesting there's more to the story.
There definitely are some fascinating contradictions and parallels that complicate that traditional narrative. For instance, the Sirah claims that the Muslims were reluctant to fight because they thought it was just going to be a simple raid. However, the Quran, which is a primary source from that time, actually suggests that they knew it would be a battle and they were afraid. This discrepancy, suggests that the Sirah might be kind of downplaying the internal divisions that may have existed within the early Muslim community.
That's a really intriguing detail. It's like they were trying to present this united front, even if there were disagreements going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. And there's another fascinating layer to this. The striking similarities between the Badrian narrative and these pre-Islamic Arabian stories of what are called sinful wars.
Sinful wars. I'm not familiar with that term. What were those?
These were essentially battles that were fought over caravans in pre-Islamic Arabia. And what's fascinating is that the Badr story shares very specific details and language with these accounts. For example, both use this very rare word, alatima, to describe a specific type of ambush. This suggests the possibility that the Badr narrative might have actually borrowed elements from these existing stories, rather than being this completely unique event.
So it's possible that even a pivotal event like the Battle of Badr might have been shaped and reshaped over time, incorporating elements from earlier narratives. It really makes you question the reliability of historical accounts, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and this skepticism extends to other raids that are attributed to Muhammad and his followers, even after Badr. For example, the source we're looking at raises questions about the raids that were led by Zayd bi Haritha.
What makes those raids suspicious?
Well, for one thing, the accounts claim that the same individual, Zayd bi Haritha, intercepts caravans carrying the same goods and even the same people multiple times. It seems a little too convenient, don't you think?
It does sound a bit like a recycled plot point. But couldn't it also be possible that Zaid was just incredibly skilled at what he did, and the sources are simply reflecting his success.
That's definitely a possibility. And it's important to acknowledge that we are dealing with limited information from,
Mm.
a very distant past. But the repetition does raise valid questions about the accuracy and potential embellishment of these accounts.
That's a great point. It reminds us to be discerning readers of history and not take everything we read at face value.
Absolutely. And the source goes even further, questioning whether Muhammad's allies were truly boycotting Mecca, as the traditional narrative suggests. This leads us to kind of explore the roles of figures like Thumama bi Uthal al-Anafi and Abu Bahir al-Thaqafi, which I think will be a fascinating discussion. But before we jump into that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what we've covered so far. What stands out to you about these challenges to the traditional narrative?
You know what strikes me most is how easily we can be swayed by a compelling narrative, even when there might be gaps or inconsistencies in the evidence. It's a good reminder to always be asking questions and looking for those subtle clues that might lead us to a more complete understanding of the past.
I completely agree. It's all about peeling back the layers and embracing the complexities of history. So let's dive into those figures you mentioned, the allies of Muhammad. The traditional narrative often presents this picture of, a unified front against Mecca. But when we look closer, it gets a little more complex.
You're talking about people like Thumama bi Uthal al-Lanafi, right? He's often portrayed as a key figure in enforcing this boycott against Mecca.
Exactly. The story goes that he converted to Islam after being captured by Muhammad's force. He played a big role in kind of cutting off supplies to Mecca from his region. But there are alternative accounts that paint a very different picture.
Really? What do those accounts suggest?
Well, some sources actually claim that Thumama was plotting against Muhammad before he was even captured. And if that's true, it completely changes our understanding of their relationship and his motivations. Makes you wonder if that whole story of his devout conversion and his role in the boycott was embellished later on.
It's fascinating. It's like someone was trying to rewrite his story to fit a particular narrative, but why would they do that?
Well, it's important to remember that these accounts were often written decades, even centuries after the events they describe. And later authors might have had their own reasons for portraying Thumama as this loyal follower of Muhammad, even if that wasn't necessarily the whole story.
You're saying they might have been influenced by events that happened after Thumama's supposed conversion?
Exactly. For example, during the Ridda Wars,
Yeah.
those conflicts that arose after Muhammad's death, Thumama actually fought on the side of the Muslims. So this later loyalty, might have led some to kind of reinterpret his earlier actions in a more favorable light, creating this narrative of unwavering devotion to Muhammad.
It's a good reminder that history is often written by the victors, right? And their perspective can really shape how events are portrayed. So if Thumama's role in this supposed boycott is questionable, what about other allies? You mentioned Abu Bakr al-Thaqafi, who seemed to operate more independently.
Ah, yes, Abu Bakr. He's an interesting character. A Meccan who converted to Islam but then escaped to Medina. The Meccans understandably wanted him back. They had a treaty with Muhammad and invoked that treaty for his return.
So did Muhammad hand him over?
Initially, he agreed, but Abu Bakr managed to escape while he was being transported back to Mecca. And that's where things get really interesting. He essentially became like a rebel leader.
A rebel leader? How so?
Well, he started gathering other escaped slaves and even some Meccans who were sympathetic to Islam. They set up camp near Mecca and began harassing travelers in caravans.
Sounds like he was causing quite a stir. But did his actions actually disrupt Meccan trade in any significant way?
That's the key question. And the sources are a bit ambiguous on this point. They certainly highlight his activities and suggest that he was driving up prices in Mecca. But it's hard to determine the true extent of his impact.
Could it be that his role was kind of exaggerated in later accounts to fit a particular narrative, just like we saw with Thumama?
It's definitely a possibility. The traditional narrative often portrays Abu Bakr as this kind of proto-revolutionary, fighting against the oppressive Meccans. And this image might have been particularly appealing in later centuries, when you had Islamic empires expanding and seeking to legitimize their conquests.
So by portraying early figures like Abu Bakr as these freedom fighters, they could present the Islamic expansion as a liberation movement, kind of a continuation of his struggle.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea that they were on the right side of history all along.
It's fascinating to see how these individual stories get kind of woven into this larger historical narrative, sometimes with embellishments and reinterpretations along the way. It makes you really appreciate the complexity of historical research and the need to always question those sources.
Absolutely. And speaking of questioning the sources, There's one more aspect of this topic we should explore. The source also raises a really interesting question about the potential economic impact of Muhammad's migration to Medina itself.
That's an intriguing angle. I hadn't really considered that before. How could the migration itself have impacted Meccan trade?
Well, remember that many of Muhammad's early followers were also merchants. So their sudden departure from Mecca could have disrupted those existing trade networks and maybe even caused some economic instability.
That makes sense. It's like losing a significant portion of your workforce, especially in a specialized field like trade. There would definitely be consequences.
Precisely. However, the source acknowledges that we don't have enough evidence to draw any firm conclusions about the actual impact of the migration on Meccan trade. It's more of a thought-provoking question than a definitive answer.
So we're left with a bit of a mystery then. Did the migration have a significant economic effect? Or was its impact more subtle and indirect?
It's a question worth pondering, and it highlights the fact that history is full of these unanswered questions, these gaps in our knowledge.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces. But even with those missing pieces, we can still learn a lot by examining the available evidence and considering those different perspectives.
Exactly. And that's what makes historical inquiry so engaging. It's a continuous process of exploration and discovery. We might never have all the answers, but the journey itself is full of fascinating insights.
So if we step back and look at everything we've discussed, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into Muhammad and Meccan trade?
Well, I think the most crucial point is that the traditional narrative, which often emphasizes, Muhammad's aggressive economic warfare against Mecca, really needs to be approached with a critical eye.
You're saying that the reality might have been far more nuanced and complex than those simple stories suggest.
Precisely. When we examine the sources closely, considering their biases, potential exaggerations, and later reinterpretations, a much more intricate picture emerges. It's a picture that challenges our assumptions and invites us to think critically about the forces that shaped early Islam.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've gone beyond the surface level and really dug into the complexities of this historical period.
I agree. It's been a pleasure exploring these questions with you.
And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive. But as we've learned, the exploration of history never truly ends. There are always more questions to ask, more perspectives to consider, and more stories to uncover. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here. And if trade disruption wasn't the sole driver of early Islam's success, what else might have been at play? The source hints at a few alternative factors, right?
It does. One intriguing possibility is that the Muslims actually benefited from their pre-existing connections within that Meccan trade network. Remember, they didn't just vanish into the desert after migrating to Medina. They carried with them valuable knowledge and relationships, and those could have been leveraged in new and innovative ways.
So instead of disrupting existing trade, they might have adapted and kind of integrated themselves into different parts of the system, almost like a vine, finding new paths to grow and flourish.
That's a great analogy. It really challenges that traditional narrative of a complete break and suggests a more fluid and adaptable approach to economic activity.
Yeah. And wouldn't those pre-existing relationships have given them a significant advantage? They already had that foundation of trust and familiarity within the trading world, which could have opened doors that might have remained closed to outsiders.
Precisely. And this raises a really interesting question. Could these existing networks have been even more crucial to early Islam's success than any supposed disruption of Meccan trade?
That's a thought-provoking idea. It really reframes the whole narrative and encourages us to consider, alternative explanations for their economic and political growth.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely a simple story of cause and effect. There are often multiple factors at play, interacting in complex and sometimes unexpected ways.
And speaking of complexity, what about the internal dynamics in Medina itself? It wasn't exactly a homogenous society, right? Didn't Muhammad's arrival kind of shake things up quite a bit?
Absolutely. Medina was home to all these different tribes and religious groups, each with their own interests and alliances. And Muhammad's arrival introduced this whole new dynamic into this already complex social and political landscape. So it's very likely that these internal shifts in power and allegiances played a significant role in early Islam's success.
So it might not have been just about, external conflicts with Mecca, but also about navigating and influencing those internal dynamics of Medina.
Exactly. By forging alliances, mediating disputes, and establishing a new social order, Muhammad was able to create this power base that extended beyond just economic activities.
It's like he was playing this multi-dimensional game of chess, strategically maneuvering within both the internal and external arenas, it certainly adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of this period.
It definitely does, and it highlights the importance of considering those social and political factors alongside economic ones. When we're analyzing historical events,
This deep dive has been such an eye-opener. We started with this seemingly straightforward narrative of economic warfare, but through our exploration of this source material, we've uncovered a much more intricate and fascinating story.
it's amazing how even a single academic article can really challenge our assumptions and illuminate these new avenues of inquiry.
It reminds us that history is not just this static set of facts, but an ongoing conversation, a constant process of interpretation and reinterpretation. And by engaging with, diverse sources and perspectives, we can enrich that conversation and deepen our understanding of the past.
Well said. And as we've seen today, that process of discovery can be incredibly rewarding, revealing those hidden layers of complexity and nuance.
A huge thank you to you for guiding us through this thought-provoking material and for sharing your expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into early Islam. Remember, history is full of these fascinating puzzles, these mysteries waiting to be unraveled. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.